Hello everyone and welcome to the February edition of the Great Tribal Warriors of Bharat, which is a monthly series recapturing the contributions made by the indigenous people of India that led to the country's freedom in 1947. You see, it's a little bit fascinating that on a day when you could be celebrating your birthday or observing a wedding anniversary or some other important milestone of your life, back in time in history, that same day would have been when somebody, one of our freedom fighters, was getting arrested, was getting out on bail, getting a charge made against him or her, or getting guillotined or hanged to death. And all of that is why today you and I are able to have such celebratory moments. A little paradoxical in nature, and obviously it shouldn't not let us go on a guilt trip, but it's always nice to recollect the sacrifices of people whom we never knew, just so that people who they never knew in the future would be able to live a wonderful life. So here we go. 14th of February could mean multiple things to many people. But for those with an interest in history, the irony would not be lost that while so many in India take time out on that day to pay tribute to the sacrifices made by the Indian Army in the Pulwama attack that happened a few years ago, 190 years ago, exactly on that same day in 1832, a similar attack had happened, but in a slightly different context. Actually, by and large, the same context, preserving the safety and security of our land. Well, in today's time, it's one particular nation. Back in 1832, though, it was a very specific country. Actually, not even country, a representative of that country, the East India Company. Well, what really happened? In our January edition, we had talked about the Cold Revolt, and we had mentioned the reasons that led up to that and how the revolt was picking up steam as it started and continued through the winter of 1831. And there was a hint that it was soon about to flatten out, be quenched, and that was going to be covered in the month of February. Yes, that's true. In January of 1832, the Cold Revolt had peaked, and it was immensely clear to the East India Company administration that this could not be just handled like any other disturbance. This was something serious. And so, by the daybreak of 14th February, Captain Impey, along with 4 companies of the 50th Bengal Native Infantry and 40 troopers, landed, or rather reached, the Siligam village, which is a little known village in present-day state of Jharkhand, to contain the disturbances. It was meant to be a battle, but it ended as a massacre. They of course came in with a lot of modern weaponry, but at the end, they ended up in a hand-to-hand combat with the Kol people, and about 150 Kol villagers were killed. And that included the leader of the revolt, Buddhu Bhagat, 7 of his sons, and his brothers. The old women and senior citizens as such were imprisoned, and that included Buddhu Bhagat's sisters-in-law as well. One of his sons managed to escape, and it is through him that we know whatever actually transpired. But that was back in 1832. We have now the research and the written records left to bank on to know what really happened, and that's what is contained in this book. The event was widely reported in the papers prevalent at that time, which was Bengal Harkuru and the Calcutta Chronicles. And while some of the journalists tried to downplay it by reporting it as a jolly good drubbing being given to the Kol people, some journalists were indeed sympathetic, and they declared in their headlines that freedom shrieked when Buddhu Bhagat fell. And Buddhu Bhagat was often given the metaphor of being the rock, because as a fairly old man, he was leading and safeguarding his people and his community from the violent administration of the East India Company. When the army of the East India Company set out to round up and arrest the leader of the various uprisings that happened across in the regions that they had control over, they were not always successful in their first attempt. Sometimes there were a group of leaders, like in the case of the Santhal Hul, which was led by 4 brothers Siddo, Kano, Chand, Bhairab. In this case, they were able to capture Siddo quite easily Yes, they did have a bit of a struggle, but he was the easiest to get to. And so they did. Of course, they had to use treachery, but they were able to arrest him and put him to death. The other brothers were still evading. Finally, it was in the February of 1856 that they were able to nab down the remaining three, Kanu, Chand and Bhairav, and they were sentenced to death by hanging. 1750 and 1914 are centuries apart, but what unites both is the date 11th of February. In 1750, this was the momentous day when Tilka Majhi was born. He was the heir to Chandra Murmu, who was the head of the Santhal community, and that meant that Tilka, as a young boy, was growing up, grooming himself to be the heir apparent, the crown prince, shall we say, but in the Santhal lingo, he was called the Jog Majhi, which meant that he was the chief of all the Santhal children. And this was a very divinely bestowed right on Tilka Majhi, his father, and the entire lineage, because the Santals believed that only their god, Marang Buru, had the power to choose who was going to lead the community. And this happened during a sacred ceremony at a very sacred grove designated for this purpose. So that was back in 1750, but fast forward to 1914, then it was also the day when Guru Gobind Giri, the leader of the Bhil people who initiated a lot of social reforms for the upliftment of the Bhil people, was convicted to life imprisonment by Major Gov and Mr. Allison of the Bombay Civil Services and the Government of India, because they looked at him as being the leader of the Mangarh massacre, someone who had led a revolt against the British. He was sentenced to 10 years of rigorous life imprisonment and was lodged at the Hyderabad jail. However, he served only half of that term. In 1919, on grounds of good behavior, he was released, but he was banned from entering the Bhil stronghold of Banswara, Mewar, Dungarpur and Sirohi. And as a result of that, he migrated to the Panchmahal district in the Dahod region, which falls today in the Gujarat state. And he spent the rest of his life trying to revive the Samp Sabha and the Bhagat Andolan, though unfortunately it could not gather the steam that it earlier had. His major contribution in his later half of life, the last days of his life rather, was the song O Bhuretia Nahi Manu Re Main Nahi Manu, in which he captured the entire massacre that had happened in 1913. And it has become sort of an anthem that keeps the spirit of that massacre alive, the contributions of the Bhil people towards fighting the British alive. And it is even sung today and it's a very well-known song, devotional song amongst the Bhil community. And on the occasion of this anniversary, it is sung. Moving on to the February of 1931, it was the month when Haipu Jadanong was arrested by the British. He was a social leader, a religious leader, guiding the Naga people to uniting against not just the British but also uniting as a community to revive their own culture as a protest to the forced conversions that were happening at that time. Now, with Jadanong arrested, the entire onus of that movement fell on his cousin, whom he had groomed for this purpose. And the cousin was Gaiden Liu, who was later on given the title of Rani by Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. But at the time she was just Gaiden Liu, and she realized the importance of this transfer of power that had happened to her and the responsibility that she had. And she did an incredible job. She responded exactly a year later when she attacked the Assam Rifles outpost at the Hungrum village at the North Kachar Hills as a 17-year-old with a self-raised army. This completely blew the fuse of the British army, and they set after her life like wild men. They offered tax breaks and monetary rewards to anybody who would give information on how to capture Gaiden Liu, but it was going to be really very difficult. It was going to be a really very long battle before they could lay their hands on her. More on this interesting story as the months roll by, because Her final capture happened quite later in that year. But eventually, this grand life came to an end on 17th of February 1993 when she passed away. We all know who the father of the nation is, but it's just a little bit unfair in my opinion that we do not have a mother of the nation when in fact we do. Well, it's the wife of the father of the nation, and in this case it is Kasturba Gandhi. Well, her birth anniversary is certainly celebrated as Motherhood Day, that comes later in the year in April. But I think she has been quite underrated and under-recognized for the contributions that she made, the kind of inspiration she gave to so many women, and the suffering that she went through to offer support to her husband and the freedom struggle. Because you see, we are talking about a time when women were not encouraged to step out of their homes, let alone fight the British. So there comes a woman who fasts, goes on riots, leads and inspires people, delivers speeches, and gets together women and children to disobey the British administration. She achieved this purely on her own merit. And so I think she deserves a little bit extra recognition, especially for the kind of inspiration that she gave to the women, one of whom was Dashriben Chaudhary, and her contribution in helping Kasturba Gandhi read, write, and achieve the satisfaction of finally having written a letter to Gandhi was fulfilled by Dashriben Chauhan, and this is very well recorded in this book, The Great Tribal Warriors of Bharat, and many such interesting anecdotes that make lively the little known life of Kasturba Gandhi and of course Dashriben Chauhan. Kasturba passed away on the 22nd of February, and this had a major impact on Dashriben. She was almost like crushed, because you see, so deep was the impact of Kasturba on her that eventually she grew up. She met Kasturba as a child. So that means that by the time India gained independence, she was an adult, and by that time she was actually looking a lot like Kasturba, walking like her, talking like her, and everyone else who knew Kasturba and had met Dashri felt that Kasturba was living again through Dashriben Chaudhary. So that's the kind of impact one can have, and that's exactly what Kasturba had on the women who knew her. So that's the roundup for February. I hope you had a little bit of new knowledge coming in from this video, and if you do, please do let me know, and I hope you will stay tuned for the next edition coming out in March. Until then, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.